Mostly Movies, where we mostly discuss movies mostly. I'm your host, Dan Siri. Once again, in the kitchen, I'm getting some chicken Alfredo ready. Let's talk about some movies. The Jesus Revolution, which I thought was a great film, one of the best I've seen this year. It's sort of like Almost Famous for evangelical Christianity. It was an interesting historical time in our country back then, in the early 70s, because we had been through Vietnam, we'd been through the tumult of the 60s, and basically people were really searching in this country for, America that is, for a greater spiritual experience, because they had been so turned off by, basically they tried everything in the 60s, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and they still felt at the end of it, they felt that there was still something lacking. A lot of people felt that. So I thought that the film really well, brilliantly captured the time. The soundtrack was great. The characterizations were good. Yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. If you're not a believer, I don't know what you'll make of this film. And I mean, I'm sort of, as a Christian, I'm also an apologist for a lot of Christian films. And I'm usually a little bit nicer to them. Like, I've been a little kinder to some of the Sorbo masterpieces than most critics. But I thought that this one was actually really good. This is like a legitimate movie. And I would say that the Christian films have come a long way from the ones that we had seen growing up. We had to watch lots of really corny, it was the 70s, it was the 80s, the budgets were very small. It was hard to find actors because they thought that it might hurt their career. But I also have to hand it to, these other actors like Jim Caviezel's recent movie, which again, I think the success of that movie is interesting because what we're starting to see is people are tired of the superheroes, they're tired of the big, bloated blockbusters. I'm just going to stir this up a little bit. These big blockbusters that have no personality and really nothing to say, especially now. I mean, we're basically where superhero genre is now is basically westerns towards the end of the 50s and into the early 60s. And unless you're like Sergio Leone or Sam Peckinpah, there's not a lot of Leones or Peckinpahs in the superhero genre. Maybe James Gunn, but we'll see. We'll see what he does with DC. I also saw Evil Dead Rise. Now, again, people are going to think I'm a prude because I liked the Jesus Revolution, and I really did not like this movie. I felt like, and it's not that I'm not into these type of movies. I love horror films, but I just felt that this movie really had too many gaps in logic, too many things, too many holes, too many things where it just didn't make sense what was going on in this building. I did like the idea of taking it out of the cabin and bringing it to a more urban setting, but at the same time I felt like this just doesn't work. This just doesn't jive. Now, I am an Evil Dead fan. I love the original three. I actually saw Army of Darkness first because when I got into them in high school, it was a little tricky to find Evil Dead 2, and Evil Dead 1 was impossible. But I had a lot of memories of the first Evil Dead because when I was a kid, we used to go to the library to rent our movies because, video stores were pretty pricey some weeks. So we would go to the library and I looked through different tapes and I would always see the Evil Dead, the original one with that great poster that's like really shocking. And my dad would be like, no, we're not renting that one. But I was always intrigued by that movie. The problem with the library was they only had about 50 or 60 movies. So that's the reason why I saw High Anxiety and Star Trek 3 about 800 times each. Because there wasn't many movies for us back in those days. So I felt like, the original Evil Dead movies are great. With each sequel, they lean more into the comedy, which usually is the detriment of a series. If you look at Evil Dead or some of the older Star Trek movies, that was a problem. They felt like, well, people seem to like comedy, so let's make it funnier. And that's how we ended up with Star Trek 5, some of the Lethal Weapon 3 and stuff like that. And that usually is a problem, but for some reason with Evil Dead, leaning more into the comedy turned out to be beneficial to the series. Evil Dead 2 is a much better film than Evil Dead 1. It's a great movie. And technically a remake of the first Evil Dead, so you don't even have to see the first Evil Dead, just out of curiosity. The third film, Army of Darkness, is my favorite. I know it's a little controversial because Evil Dead 2 is a favorite, but stir up that broccoli. But Evil Dead 2 is not as I just think there's something so fun to Army of Darkness, and Bruce Campbell, of course, is wonderful in the movie. I would say the Fede Alvarez remake was actually really good. Unfortunately, they did play it a little too straight. It was a little too serious, and any movie where a dog dies, unless it's John Carpenter's The Thing, I have trouble watching it more than one time, as good as it may be. That's why Dog Soldiers, I watched the beginning of it, and a dog is getting shot in the beginning of the film, and I'm like, nope, turn it off. And a lot of people have told me to see that movie, and I'm like, I'm not going to. But Evil Dead Rise, I don't think has any of that. It doesn't have enough humor. It just, one thing it has in abundance is a lot of real gross out gags, like really disgusting, disturbing moments that don't really need to be there. And the movie overall, even more than the Fede Alvarez Evil Dead Rise is a depressing movie. Like, you're watching this movie and it just feels like, what does it mean? And it doesn't mean anything. And characters say lines that Bruce Campbell said and it's supposed to mean something, and it just falls flat. So the movie is basically, horns down, 2 stars, it's tone deaf. I forgot to give Jesus Revolution horns up, but I feel a little weird giving Jesus Revolution horns up. Maybe horns and a halo for that one. Now we're coming to the main focus of this video, which is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Okay, let me preface this by saying, a long preface, Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of the greatest movies ever made. It's perfect, it's wonderful. Don't listen to that stupid Big Bang Theory, which is a geek minstrel show, that stupid moronic show where they basically said, oh, it doesn't matter what Indiana Jones does because it would have happened anyway. Let me tell you something. There is nothing in Big Bang Theory over their whole 10, 12-year run, not one episode, nothing they've ever done on that show could touch even the weakest scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, it couldn't even touch the weakest scene in one of the sequels, which we'll get to. So basically, that show is basically made like for nerdy guys that are trying to introduce their girlfriends to all this stuff. And it's like, no, she's not going to like it. So why are you wasting your time watching this stupid show? Just watch her shows. If you're going to watch that show, it's just pointless. But Raiders of the Lost Ark is such a great movie, and it just does, everything came together perfectly. It's one of those movies where the music was right and the staging was right. Everything came out great. So that's what you get out of that one. That one's really brilliant. And, the music, John Williams is, top notch. Spielberg's directing was great. Lucas had a lot of great ideas. And then comes Temple of Doom. Now, Temple of Doom was controversial at the time. A lot of people didn't like it. I loved it. I think it was great. I first saw it on VHS. Same thing as Raiders. Too young for the theaters. And I really wanted to see it in the summer of 1984, but my brothers are like, no, it'll really upset you. It's very scary. So I was kind of mad. And then I saw it on video a year later, and I'm like, oh man, 1985. I would have been 6 at the time. I'm like, oh, I'm kind of glad I didn't see this in the theaters, because it's a little easier to take at home. It's much scarier in the theater. But Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is actually my personal favorite of the whole series. I mean, much as I love Raiders is more of a general crowd pleaser. Something like Temple of Doom, it's like, all right, there's only going to be a few of you that really get this, but those few are going to be really happy with it because it's a really amazing movie. And as Tarantino said, when you make a specific film, you're going to turn some people off, but you're going to turn some people on too. And I feel like that one is just so different. Is it a little dated? Yes. Do a lot of things not hold up? Yes. Is it basically handling of the Hindu religion as kid glove as the handing of Judaism in the first film or Christianity in the third film? No, it's kind of done very rough and tumble. But it's a great movie. It's basically a more violent version of Gunga Din. But the music is great. Everything is great in that movie. And I love it. Now, when it comes to Last Crusade came out in summer of 1989, which was a big, big summer for movies. And it was a little disappointing compared to the other two. It takes a little while to get going. I watched it again recently. My wife had never seen it. So we sat down and watched it. It does take a while to get going, but once it gets going, especially that midsection, is great. It's really good. It has a nice ending, the ride off into the sunset. And then we come to The Crystal Skull, which I had to sit through again because, again, the wife hadn't seen it, and I wanted to see it before we saw the fifth one. It doesn't hold up. The first 45 minutes to an hour or so, even the fridge scene, is fun. And it's silly and it doesn't make sense, but it's still a lot of fun to watch. However, once you get past that, you really don't have much of a movie left. You kind of don't have anything interesting going on. The villains are not strong. They're not interesting. They're not fun. They're just kind of there. And you think Cate Blanchett is a great actress. Why is she awful in this movie? Like, you think, like, can she maybe give back one of her awards? Because this is really sort of like, really just horrible to watch. But overall, it's okay. Shia LaBeouf is all right. And it's good to see Indy and Marion back together again. I kind of like that. I mean, the wedding at the end was a bit much. But I think if you know George Lucas, you know that was definitely his idea and his planning and things like that. So overall, again, like, if I'm going to have a bastardized version of Indiana Jones, I would like it to be from Lucas and Spielberg as opposed to Disney. Now, let's talk about bastardized versions. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Okay. It's a hair above the Crystal Skull. A red, mangy, coarse, dirty hair above the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. But it's still fun to watch. There's still moments in it that are great Indiana Jones moments. I just think that the film is too serious. It's taking itself too seriously. And then it decides to be silly at points, too. Like, I thought you guys were taking this too seriously, and now you're having too much fun with the whole concept of Indiana Jones and who he is. The biggest problem with this movie, again, the villains are weak. The supporting cast is a nightmare. I mean, there's nobody in the supporting cast that you like is either good or either needs to be there. It was really, really awkward and very strange and kind of a sad movie, and Indiana Jones is getting old and it's the 60s and he's telling the hippies to turn down their Beatle albums. It's just, to me, it's really weak, And as the worst thing you can do in a movie is, I mean, my horns are kind of up. They're kind of on the fence on this one. It's okay. But, I feel like there was a much better movie that could have been made out of this movie. As a matter of fact, as I was watching it, I was thinking of a better film. Phoebe Waller-Bridge is terrible in this film. She doesn't belong there. She's just another proxy for Kathleen Kennedy. She's just another brunette that has to basically knows how to do everything. Basically knows how to do everything. She can do everything. She's like a superhero in every sense of the word. There's no vulnerability. There's nothing fun about her. She's not funny. She's not interesting. It's just, I don't know what they were going for. I really don't. And I feel like she doesn't really do much of use until the very last scene where it's spoilers. She brings Marion back. And I'm like, okay, what would have been a cooler ending is if you really wanted to, make the last 2.5 hours, the movie's long. It feels like 4 hours, but it's only 2.5. If you really wanted to make it worthwhile, why don't you just use the Dial of Destiny and say, oh, I read up on Continental Drift, because basically that's what the characters do in this movie. Every time they need to know something, they know it. Like the scene where the little boy has to, Short Brown instead of Short Round. Short Round has to basically fly a plane at one point. And he's like, I don't know how to fly this plane. And he's flying the plane. I'm like, this is ludicrous. It's like Disney's weird because they give superpowers to these kids and these women. That was the same problem I had with Quantumania or the last Black Panther movie. They're making geniuses out of these little kids. And I'm like, no, come on. Maybe once in a while that trope works. But the whole genius kid thing is such a Disney, it's a boring, lazy Disney move. And I can't stand it anymore, But overall, I mean, it's okay. The last scene with Marion is actually very touching, very good. But I felt like, and then there's a nice little iris out onto the hat, and it's on a clothesline, and he grabs the hat. Well, here's a better ending. Why don't you show him reaching for the hat, and in his other hand is the dial of destiny, and he grabs the hat? That would have been a better ending. Because you could have said, oh, was he going to go back to help his son? Is he going to go back to change this or change that around? Or is he just going to, him and Marion run off to ancient Greece? Who knows? That would have been a better ending. And that's the difference between, a movie that works and a movie that doesn't work. It's those little things. Cinema is a game of inches, much like baseball. And sometimes it's these little tiny things you can do that can be the difference between a great movie and a movie that just doesn't work, that doesn't fall flat. So Indiana Jones does not end with a bang, it ends with a whimper. I would say it's worth seeing when it comes to streaming. I wouldn't really go out of my way to see this in theaters, even though I did. But it is worth checking out at least once. But to me, to be honest with you, this series was getting old and tired by the third installment. Even though Last Crusade has a lot of great moments in it, and it's a pretty good movie, really, those first two films are it for me. Like, the first two films I can watch all the time. Last Crusade I can watch every 5 or 6 years. Crystal Skull every 10 to 15 years. And this movie, maybe I'll see it again at some point in my life. But it's not like, let's rush out to see it again, I mean, it's better than Crystal Skull, but it's just, I don't know, it's sort of like, I don't know. It's not as bad as Matrix Resurrections, but it just doesn't quite have that same magic. And they could have easily done that. They could have gotten better writers. They could have done something with this. But anyway, I'm trying to go through all those library movies that you saw on the Instagram page. My problem with most movies today, and I had this trouble with Dungeons and Dragons, which I tried to watch this morning. I watched about 40 minutes of it. I usually give a movie 20 minutes, and if it's boring me, I don't keep watching it. Or I start looking at my phone, and this movie was sort of boring. So about 30 minutes into it, I start looking at the phone, and then about 40 minutes in, I'm like, why am I still watching this? And never worry about that, though. Don't think you have to see a movie to completion. If you rent a movie, or even if you go to a theater, and the film's not working for you in the first 20, 30 minutes, now it could be a good film. Maybe you're just having a bad day, or maybe you're just not in the mood. But don't ever feel that you have to watch a movie from start to finish, because as an adult, a lot of movies, I feel like I've sat through enough garbage movies in my life that I don't have to anymore. And if it's 20 minutes go by and I don't like what I'm seeing, I just turn it right off. And there's no problem with that. And basically, my rule of thumb with a movie is make me look up. Because when I press play, I have my phone, I'm checking emails, looking for jobs, I'm doing all kinds of things. Give me a reason to put my phone down and watch the movie. And a lot of movies, especially these days, can't do that. So, anyway, guys, we got a few more movies coming this summer. I want to try to catch Oppenheimer and Mission Impossible. I hope to report on those very soon. Okay? All right, this is Mostly Movies, signing off.